Welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we watch horror films and read horror books. This is Anna, your podcast host, and if this is your first time listening, we usually cover horror film history on this main feed and notable new horror releases over on the Final Girls Patreon page. But alongside our film coverage, I've been doing an irregular series that I've called the Bloody Book Club, where I interview some of the most exciting and interesting people who are writing horror today. So far, I've mostly interviewed novelists, with a few more chats that I've got in the can and will be putting out over the next few months. But today I'm talking about a non-fiction book about horror films, the latest from author and podcaster Alexandra West, co-host of the very excellent The Faculty of Horror, and sometime guest on this very podcast. Alongside her work on The Faculty of Horror, which has been personally deeply influential for me, West has authored 2 books of criticism on horror films, films of the New French Extremity and the 1990s teen horror cycle, both required reading for fans of good horror and good film criticism. Her newest book is also her most personal. Gore-Geous, Personal Essays on Beauty and Horror, is a book of visceral and vulnerable meditations on beauty through the lens of horror cinema. I've been a fan of Alex's for years now and had the pleasure of reading her book early and blurbing it. Gore-Geous is out now and I couldn't recommend it more highly. In this conversation, we talk very openly about the process of writing a book and the specific challenge of writing both personally and critically. Anyone listening who is interested or maybe in the process of writing something along those lines, I think you're going to gain a lot from hearing Alex talk. So with all that said, please enjoy my conversation with author Alexandra West. Alex, this is going to be a different kind of conversation than the ones we've previously had on the podcast, because the subject is you and your book.
Yeah. I thought I'd, finally just, let some skeletons out of the old closet and, try something new with some of my writing. So very, very excited and still a little nervous to talk about it, but really glad that you had me on.
I'll be gentle, and I've had the privilege of reading this book early before its release, and I've read your previous works as well, and as you know, won't embarrass you here, but I'm a big fan of your writing and your podcasting work in general. This is your 3rd book, I believe?
Yes.
So tell me, where was this one born from? Was this a different kind of idea that appeared to you? Was this a different kind of origin story from your previous books?
Yeah, absolutely it was. And this book was born out of an invitation. And the invitation was from the very kind people at Astrophil Press who reached out and were like, hey, do you want to do something? Do you want to work with us? What would you like to do? And they had some ideas they'd known my work. So they were floating a few ideas and they were great ideas, but they just didn't feel right or like something I really wanted to do. And the invitation came in the midst of a really tricky period which I wound up writing about in my book, which is when my marriage was falling apart. And so my marriage fell apart in the pandemic. And as I was, dealing with all of that, I had this offer to do a book. And I was coming up with ideas and trying to think about what do I want to do? What do I want to say? The world feels so different right now. And I didn't want to just do another, study of a certain type of genre of film, even though I'm sure I'll get back to that at some point. Mm-hmm. It felt like this is a time to take a bigger swing. So I pitched what eventually went on to become Gore-Geous, Personal Essays on Beauty and Horror. And they seemed to dig it over at Astrophil. So it was then a process of, 2, almost 3 years of writing it because it was such a new way of writing to me, where I was merging film criticism, which is something I feel very comfortable doing, with films I know very well, but then putting on the layer of personal my own personal journey through them. So, it's not a big book. It's quite slim in some ways, but I really tried to pack every word, every sentence, every paragraph with
Mm.
as many thoughts and ideas that could be fun and useful and like readable, and really encourage people to think about the media they're consuming and why and how and what does it all mean.
And it really, your email, when you asked me to blurb your book, really landed in my inbox at this really pivotal moment for me as well. I was just in the process of putting the finishing touches of my book,
Mm,
which is also essays on horror, but it's not um, as strict collection of essays. Or and I one of the things that I was debating a lot in the process of writing it was about how much of myself to put into the writing. And reading your book, that tension and the way that you navigate that of putting the personal into the criticism, into the critical, really stood out. And I wonder kind of how did this change of register from kind of, more straightforward form of film criticism or academic writing into the personal essay form? How did that affect your writing?
Yeah, it affected it by taking a whole lot longer than it normally does.
Mm-hmm.
I feel, kind of like Anna yourself, I'm sure, you get the assignments and you can kind of crank them out and you're always like doing your best and pushing yourself the hardest to turn this stuff around because you have to. There's a deadline.
Mm-hmm.
Things need to go to print, things need to happen. And with Astrophil, it was very like, okay, well, let's just see where this goes. Like I signed a contract and everything, but there was no set deadline where it had to go to
Yeah.
print. And so I kept sitting with it. And I was like, I really did work on this book like
Mm-hmm.
every week for 3 years. And
Mm.
the initial versions of this book were much less personal. And I was like, no, this isn't right. And I kept coming
Mhm.
back to it and I kept coming back to it. And, during this period, a lot of this book was written in the various stages of lockdown. So I didn't have a lot of distractions. I only had myself and I was, going through stuff with myself all the time. And, even to, the last kind of like, okay, we're going to put this book in layout. I was like, no, there's still a few things I need to be very clear about.
Mhm.
And I kept coming back to this book when I'd go back and read stuff that I'd, maybe put to bed a while earlier and
Mhm.
read them. And I'd be like, I'm not telling the truth. I'm not
Yeah.
telling the full truth. And a big part of what I've been thinking about and dealing with over the last few years is like all of these secrets that we keep. And some secrets you
Mhm.
have to keep. They're not for everyone to know. And that's absolutely fine. And, you have to have those safeties within relationships. But there were so many things that I, had to hold on to for various reasons that were just hurting me.
Mhm.
And it wasn't helping me to be protecting other people or protecting that part of myself. So I had a lot of, long thinks. I was going for long walks and just thinking about, you know, I'm not protecting anyone by not being honest.
Mhm.
And, at the very least, I can be honest and, maybe inspire some other people to think, what am I doing that's really affecting me? And, maybe even, help some people because it was certainly, seeing pieces of media and writing where people were really honest that really helped me through it.
Mhm.
Um, and so, yeah, that it was a long process and I'm a very private person.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of like sitting with myself and just being like, you sure you want to do this? And, answering myself back. Yeah, it's time.
It really comes across super strongly in your writing. Every sentence is so clean and clear and deliberate. And you're talking about these films, but you're talking about yourself through the films, even through the selection of them. And I was wondering, how did you select the films that you wanted to dive into in this book?
That's such a great question because, Anna, like yourself, when you're kind of known for a certain, speciality in a certain group of
Mhm.
films, you tend to always be asked about them and focus on them. And
Yeah.
I love films in general. Most days I'm watching at least one movie. And, when I was doing my new French Extremity book or my 90s teen horror book, it was like the roadmap had already been drawn for me. I knew what I had to cover, and I, could make some, I could make some adjustments, but not a whole lot if I was really going to tell the story of that cycle of films. And so when I think about, my life and like the cycle that this, book takes you on, the journey you go on, I came up with all the topics I wanted to talk about first. So something that's always really intrigued me is the idea of natural beauty.
Yes.
The idea of like having a routine, of, being thin, of, all these things I get into in my book. So I started with those, and I had a couple others that, eventually fell away, and I was like, that's not quite right. So I came back to like these 5 really clear, precise ideas for me. And then underneath them, I still have the piece of paper like buried in my, files somewhere. But I literally just like started sketching out like, these are the films that come to mind when I think about this topic. And, each chapter had, a list of probably, I want to say 5 or 6 films. And then each essay in this final book has 2 films that I write about. So it's 10 films total in the book. And I just kind of whittled them away. And to like this film speaks to something deep within me, for better or for worse. This is something that at some point in my life imprinted on me. And, some of them come from when I was a child, and some of them come from, a couple years ago, seeing them, later on in life and being like, ooh, I am wrestling with this film on some level that I don't understand, but I can make a connection between the subject of this film and the subject I want to talk about. And so much of the writing was figuring out that connection, which wasn't readily present to me. And so getting to do that was a really incredible, frankly, exercise for myself, and to not be beholden to like, you have to write about these films from this place or by this director, and just getting to sit with myself as a film fan, a film critic, and be like, what are the films that have meant something to me? And what I hope is, again, like people will read this and maybe they'll be really interested in the things I have to say about some of these films, but it'll inspire some more of their own reflection to say, wow, I really loved that movie that I saw X amount of years ago. I wonder why. And, sit with that and like, let's wrestle with these ideas a little more than maybe, we do naturally. So yeah, it was a really interesting process.
And I want to dig into a few of the ideas that you explore in the book, because even in the very premise, the connection between beauty and horror is not one that we readily think about. And it's something that, again, touched me so much when I read the book, because I had been wrestling with this very idea in the process of writing my own. It was like, some of these things, even the ones that are considered grotesque by some people, I find very tender or beautiful. And I genuinely believe there's moments of tenderness and gorgeousness in horror. And I wanted to dig into this idea of natural beauty that you mentioned. How does horror do this? Because it's something that we're sold and packaged over and over again in real life. But how does it present itself through horror?
Yeah, so the idea of natural beauty, and that idea is like, you wake up beautiful, you wake up attractive. You don't have to get your hair done and your makeup done or have plastic surgery. There's something innately beautiful about you or the character, whoever it is we're talking about. And for so much of our history and our cultures, we've assigned, physical attractiveness with goodness. And so that is perpetually linked together, those two things. And you look at all the, content, media, art, entertainment we consume, it's mainly very classically attractive people that we are centering, saying, they take up space, they can be stand-ins for us. So in many ways we are indoctrinated into that idea of thinking about a very specific type of beauty, and that beauty is inherent. It is an inherent thing that has been, thrust upon a person, and, they are good because they are beautiful. And, I think horror is something that, in many ways it's held that up. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
too many leads of too many horror films that are, not classically attractive.
Mm-hmm.
And so my chapter about natural beauty, I'm actually quite critical of the films that I talk about, and just in terms of like, let's question this, let's wrestle with this. Why are we only seeing, largely white, cis, hetero, able-bodied people occupying these spaces. So when I talk about natural beauty, it's, how do we wrestle with this? How can we like critique it? And like, what are the elements you pick apart?
Mm-hmm.
Snow White isn't the most interesting character in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It's the wicked stepmother
Yeah.
queen,
Yeah.
who's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And, but then even, in some ways and sometimes more subtle ways, as I talk about figures like Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, which is a film all about, in many ways, how beautiful he is and how perfect his body is. But it's also kind of saying, but what does this mean? Like, is this not like empty and
Mm-hmm.
devoid of like anything meaningful that we care about? It's really like if you actually, scratch that surface, it's what lies underneath is actually terrifying. And I love that sentiment so much. And I think that's, one of the reasons I go back to American Psycho so often, because it just is like you can give up everything you hold dear in order to attain this perfect body, this, very impeccably groomed aesthetic, but it doesn't really mean anything.
Mm. And I wanted to. You mentioned Snow White and the Wicked Witch being the most interesting character, and in the same essay where you write about natural beauties, you're writing about the witches in Roald Dahl's The
Mm.
Witches, and the image of the hag, which is a figure that I'm very fascinated by. And you write about them as abominations of femininity and power. Do you think in these films and in general, and maybe even Patrick Bateman in a way fits into this too? Do you think of beauty as a corruptive force in horror as much as power is?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And, when you have to be beautiful
Mm-hmm.
is to kind of have power, to have stature, even if you didn't earn it. Like
Mm-hmm.
most of the time, you don't earn it. You're just like, think of the amount of celebrities who are just, incredibly lucky
Yeah,
genetically.
you're just
And
genetically blessed. You don't have to
yeah,
do that much work to get there.
yeah, and now they get to occupy all of this time and space in our culture because of that. And so I think the notion of anyone who fakes it, anyone who tries to like trick you and trick in air quotes,
Mm-hmm.
through plastic surgery, through makeup, like
Mm-hmm.
we think of the way that celebrities are treated if and when they have plastic surgery or too much filler or Botox, and it's like, look at them, they're trying
Mm-hmm.
to trick us. And it's we are uh, it's constantly finding ways, for the patriarchal forces that, still are a big part of this world, to cast doubt on, people who fall out of line, who fall out of, what they comprehend and what they understand. So I think in many ways to be a beauty that is accepted by society is, a form of is a form of adhesion, like you've given
Mm-hmm.
in yourself to buy into this larger social structure and to give yourself up for it, and you lose a lot of what is unique and interesting and challenging, because you're becoming a homogenous force within the culture.
Mm. And there's this idea of almost an individual disappearing, both seeking out to disappear into the dominant culture and what's expected of them, what's the dominant idea of beauty as well, but then finding nothing once they achieve it. And I go back to Patrick Bateman with this idea, and you write a lot in your essays about the idea of rituals, of beauty rituals, of self-improvement rituals. That might be exercise, it might be skincare, it might be makeup, it might be plastic surgery. but they all fit into this idea of creating oneself to fit into this idea of beauty, right? And how do you think horror shows or perverts these rituals?
It's interesting because there's so much of horror, whatever subgenre you love the most or you're the most familiar with, that is, a set of tropes.
Yeah.
And, the slasher has this set, the zombie film has this set, body horror has this set. And it's always, I think, is if you're fans of that genre, you kind of are like, ooh, how does any one given film adhere to them and how does it subvert them?
Hmm.
And I think in many ways, when we look at beauty and horror, which to me really are two sides of the same coin. They're two extremes that
Hmm.
are perpetually kind of at play with each other. You go too far in one direction or the other, and you're in the other's territory, which can always be very odd. But
Yeah.
it's yeah, when we think of Patrick Bateman or we think of Nina Sayer in
Hmm.
Black Swan, they give everything. They give everything and they're, fighting and pushing, like even once they've achieved a certain level, they're still like so like punchy and violent, and it's so weird to see them like achieve
Hmm.
something and then it's like the attempt to achieve it was the true journey.
Hmm.
Once you achieve it, and horror will do this. They show you what happens when you achieve something, and then it's like it's all about control and how do you get to stay in that space? How do you get to maintain whatever control you eventually sought out and got?
Mm. And you write also, you have a chapter that I really appreciated about kind of the difference between beauty and sexiness
Mm.
or sex appeal, and thinking even about Patrick and Nina, neither one of those characters, no matter how beautiful or in control or devoted they are to their bodies and their particular goals. In the case of Nina, it's this fanatical almost devotion to dance and to being the perfect ballerina and to perfecting this one performance. Neither one of them are what I would describe as sexy. Their kind of lack of sex appeal is one of the strange elements of them, and it works beautifully in the films. But I wonder, how do you think that horror films treat sexiness and beauty differently?
I mean, it's again, it's interesting because for so long, especially in the 80s when like slashers were all over the place, there was, sex and death were hand in hand. The sexy kids go off and fornicate, and then, they're the
Mm-hmm,
first to
mm-hmm.
die, or that's when, Jason or Michael or Freddy gets them. So horror has like a really complicated history with sex and sexuality. And I think in the two films I chose to talk about when I talked about sexiness were ones that were very critical of those who were deemed and coded and designed to be sexy, and how they are initially perceived as the aggressor, but it actually makes them more vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
It makes them much more open to attacks, to violence, to things like that, which to me is that's way more of what I hear of through lived experiences, through friends' experience, through what I read in the news is that kind of violence is still permeating our culture. And, it's a really sad thing because I think, many people are scared of embracing their sexuality to each person because we are taught to be scared of it. And so the horror I find that is really interesting and very contemporary once we move away from the kind of standard slashers of, particularly the 80s, is having a lot of different instances of figures who are coded and designed to be sexy and what happens to them, how they are maybe initially perceived to be threats to a heteronormative patriarchal society, but then through the journey of the film, they are, facing their own, versions of sexual violence, of violence, period, and they have to navigate that. And so it gives us as an audience a different language and a different narrative than what we're often told about, sexy people, particularly
Mm-hmm.
sexy women.
Mm-hmm. And do you think there is a bad kind of beauty in horror? Do you think anyone who is coded as beautiful or perhaps sexy in a horror film can also be coded as bad or nefarious in some way?
I mean, that's generally how characters like that are perceived. There is, so many, if you are, especially, let's just say women, if you are
Mm-hmm.
beautiful and you are sexy and alluring, then you're just falling into this deep coding of the temptress who
Mm-hmm.
is always like about the downfall of man. And, she may be like the sexy girl right off the top, but really she's going to get you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like there's something there where it just becomes very toxic. And we've have this figure throughout our history, and I write about a bunch of different examples, but film noir and the femme fatale, figures in gossip circles, and how they're like, ooh, there's that home wrecker, we don't like her. And it's so toxic because it is in service of protecting men usually, and rarely are men asked in these scenarios of like, hey, what were they doing in the midst of all of this? What role did they play? And it's like, no, they were just helpless men. They couldn't help having sex and falling in love with this evil woman. And it's like we've perpetuated this narrative over and over and over again. And horror is big part of that. If you look at so many female villains in horror, a lot of other genres, they're often the sexy beautiful woman, or a woman who
Mm-hmm.
grows beautiful and sexy through power. You think of a lot of witches in films. It's they derive power from being young and like youthful, or that's like what they're trying to do, is get the potion to make them young again. And
Yeah.
there is this kind of like, again, the male hero's journey is something, distinct and sacred. And for a female character, it's like a journey from being not pretty to pretty often.
Mm-hmm.
And what does she do with that power? And how does it often corrupt her?
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. And if a villainess is coded as not beautiful, then her main goal, the thing that is corrupting her, is this desire to become beautiful, so she can have more power. It doesn't actually give her anything. There's no gain that she achieves through it. And I find it fascinating. But I was wondering, through the process of writing this book, did your relationship with the films change?
Um, it it deepened my
Mm-hmm.
relationship with these films. And, I started out by, knowing all of these films really meant something to me.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd seen them like so many times, and they'd all meant something to me. And I was like, oh, I guess, I'll figure out what these films are really trying to say to me. And often what they were saying to me as I was wrapping up the book, and I write a little bit about it in the afterword to it,
Mm-hmm.
of, these aren't just films I enjoyed. They were they were mirrors. They were
Mm-hmm.
showing me parts of myself that I wasn't ready to admit to, but I was, clearly dealing with them on some level. And they were, in many ways inviting me to think about them in a way that felt safe before I was ready to deal with them, full on.
Mm. And as before we start winding down, Alex, we started the conversation by talking about the intensely personal nature of these writings, which is very much in the title, and it's in the DNA of the book. And I wonder particularly about the essay, which deals with the end of your marriage and where you get a lot more personal than in previous ones. How did you balance the revealing emotional truths about yourself without revealing too much detail, and talking about the way that you viewed yourself, your place in the world, and horror films, versus this keeping a distance with the reader, and also not giving away too much detail about other people in your life who are not writing the book, who are not participating in the act of writing it?
Yeah, it's I had a sense early on when I was doing the outline for this book that I was
Mm-hmm.
going to write about my marriage, and the as it fell apart, it really just knocked me on my ass. But as you pick yourself back up again, and you always pick yourself back up again, eventually it always happens. You begin to rethink your life, and I think the dissolution of my marriage was like, oh, I bought into so much stuff. I like unknowingly, unconsciously. And when it all fell apart, the things I had invested in too heavily, um, many of them didn't serve me in that moment. They didn't help me. It was like my friends, my family, me being, smart and like understanding the process of separation and divorce and like navigating through that. Like that's what got me through it. Um, so I knew I wanted to write that story because it was something that I've heard a lot of people talk about, quietly, anecdotally between friends, but I think it's something we should talk more about. Not just about marriage, but just like the moments that you thought you knew what was happening, and then all of a sudden it changes. And it is that, kind of duality that I think is really fascinating. And I'm also very cognizant because, there's a lot of like personal essays and writings and memoirs where people take their partner, their ex-partner to task, and they air all of the dirty laundry. And that was something I very, very much did not want to do. And as I sat with that, I thought, you know what, I'm going to come from a place of my emotional honesty. And I can't pretend to know what he felt at that time. He and I talked obviously a lot during that time, but I can write that down for him. There's so many details that are his, and then ours together. And now that we're not a couple, I was like, that stays in a place that is for him and me to know. And a lot of it is just for him to know. And that's fine. That's, I really believe that, marriage, partnership, all of that stuff, long-term relationships, it deeply involves the two people, however many people you have in it. And to talk about them without their consent, without their sign off, I find it makes me feel uncomfortable. So I spent a lot of time just like, how can I talk about this? How can I be honest? And, if he did read it, how would he feel? And I did have that in the back of my mind because, he's a person too, and he went through it too. And there's a lot that's his story to tell. And I was very, very grateful. My friend and colleague and sister in horror, Allison Lang, who's a great writer and editor herself, she and I had been talking about this project a lot. And so I asked her, when I get some of these first drafts done, will you give this a read? And she knew me before I was with my ex. She knew me throughout my entire relationship to my ex. She's also been through, a marriage falling apart. And so she was a great set of eyes just to have. And she's very, very empathetic. So she was a great set of eyes just to have, saying like, I understand what you're doing. I think you've done it, and we could talk about it. And that was just, I think something I really needed at that time is to have someone I trust, someone who knows me really well, say, this makes sense, because I also very much wanted, someone reading it not to get bogged down in the details of a breakup, which can often be very salacious, and just to give people space to think about, their own journeys with that kind of stuff.
I think the time and the thoughtfulness and the precision that you put into writing about yourself and these moments in your personal life without getting bogged down in the details really, really come through. And I'm always intrigued and interested in arts or film criticism that gets to a personal heart without drowning in personal detail. And I think you so achieved that with Gore-Geous. And I was wondering if this is a form of film criticism that you see yourself continuing writing in.
Yeah, ultimately, there were some really hard moments writing this, but it's something I think, as I sit here today, it's probably one of the things I'm most proud of that I've done on my own. And I have to say, and I've been fortunate enough to be, co-hosting the Faculty of Horror for, oh my God, over 11 years now. And, I do that with another one of the closest people in the world to me, Andrea Subasati. And we sit there and we just talk to each other about film criticism and thoughts and themes and analysis. And it's, such a joy in my life. And sometimes a personal story will come through. And just that's what happens when you're sitting next to like one of your best friends shooting the shit about movies, because it's, very important to understand everyone's standpoint theory. I relate to this moment because of XYZ that happened to me, or I challenge this moment in a story because of ABC that happened to me. I think that's a very, very valid form of criticism. There's an artistry to it, but I think it is so valid. So, and some of the personal stuff over the 11 plus years, we've taken out. We've gotten to like the edit and we're like, oh, no, that's not quite right. Or we didn't want to say it like that. So we take it out. But there's a lot of stuff that's gone through and that has been in the episode. So, I feel very fortunate that we have listeners who, are very respectful. If, something like that bubbles up, it's not every episode, but when it does, they're very respectful. And some of them have written like really beautiful emails or DMs to us just saying like, hey, when you talked about that, Alex, when you mentioned that, Andrea, that really helped me, or I understood that. And it was like, yeah. So I had on some level a like sense that people were really responsive to that when it's done in the right way and with that kind of thoughtfulness around it. So it was definitely a big thing to sit down and write it very intentionally, because sometimes the personal stuff in the podcast will just kind of come out of the conversation. Yeah. So being very intentional with it is something new to me. And obviously, I maybe not obviously, but, as soon as I could, form a complete sentence after, I was going through my separation, I went to therapy and, I talked a lot to my therapist about how can you be vulnerable when you've been so hurt. And, she was like, you have to practice it. You have to practice it. Practice it with those close to you and then slowly expand. And like, she was giving me all this helpful advice. And we had a session a little while ago and she was like, I was like, yeah. So I basically wrote a book about my vulnerability. And she was like, oh, I didn't mean it like that, but cool. I don't know how that will work out. And I was like, and I think I know it was actually in your blurb where you called it both like tender and vulnerable, which thank you so much. But I was like, I have never been called those two words in my life. So it's a whole new Alex West out there.
Listen, I had this with I've proudly now what I call graduated therapy, but I had a I had a therapist for a few years and she insisted on a lot of kind of similar things, and kind of those words like tenderness and vulnerability kept coming up, and those are very hard things for me to do. And that whole of like practicing, and I was like, okay, but does that mean like how many essays about it do I have to write?
Yeah.
How many podcasts do I have to make?
I need a set amount of people who I will book meetings with and be like, okay, here's 15 minutes where we're going to talk about my trauma. Then we're going to talk about your trauma. Yes. And then I get on with the rest of my day.
I need a vulnerability agenda. Like I need a KPI for my vulnerability. How do I achieve maximum vulnerability, please? And thank you.
KPI for vulnerability. Yeah. I think, ask a female podcaster in your life how their vulnerability is going.
Alex, before I wrap up, tell me, you've mentioned thinking about the reader, and I genuinely find it really interesting with writing film criticism, particularly in book form, because it's a different kind of beast, and publishers, the best of publishers will constantly pull you back, or at least mine have, and kind of been like, remind the reader of this, or think of the reader for that. And this kind of figure that you have in your head while you're writing, what would you like readers of Gore-Geous to take away from the book? How did you think of them when you were writing this?
Yeah, I thought of the reader constantly. And my hope and my goal is for anyone who reads the book that they see the framework for how to be critical of what we watch. You can still enjoy everything you watch. Like that's not a problem. But what are the messages we're taking away? How does this apply to our own life? If there is a film that you've watched and it's just stayed with you for a really long time in ways you can't quite explain, maybe they'll go back and wrestle with that more, or a book or a song or something like that. Like the stuff we surround us with, the stuff that we consume, it's all kind of, going into the big stew that is us. And how do we sit with that, especially as we go through moments of transformation? And moments of transformation can be benign. They can be really powerful. They can be really traumatic. They can be ecstatically happy. They can be all kinds of things. So what happens to you? Like, how are you checking? Oh God, it's a therapy term. How are you checking in with yourself? But, just having that space for yourself to think critically about, what you're surrounding yourself with. How is that serving you? How is it not serving you? I mean, is it a horror self-help book? Maybe. I don't know.
Listen, it is whatever you want to take from it. It's a great book. It's a great book of personal essays. It's a great book of horror film criticism. It's a great book of horror self-help.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. New tagline.
Alex, thank you so much for your time. It's really lovely to talk to you at any point, but particularly to talk about your work and your writing.
Yes, no, it's always such a pleasure to get to talk to you and get to spend some time with you. So thank you so much for all your support on the book. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, can't wait to read your next one. So we're just going to keep, trading off books. That's how this goes.
There's so much more horror to write about.
Never ends.